You know, we heard a little bit about the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific and the Railroad Act of 1862, and then the competition between these two railroads. Do you want to expound a little bit more on that?
Sure, I can start.
Okay.
So, in 1861, of course, the Civil War had begun. The South had seceded, and Lincoln found this to be the perfect time to sign the Railroad Act into law. And that's the reason he wanted to do this at that particular time was because the South was now out of the picture. Prior to this, in the 1850s, there had been talk about a transcontinental railroad, and there had been railroad surveys done. And there was great competition between the southern tier states, the northern tier states, and the middle tier states for getting the Transcontinental Railroad to go through their particular territory. So when the Civil War began and the South seceded, Lincoln seized that opportunity because now he could get the votes, and the South, you know, would not vote against his preference for that middle route. And that's basically the Civil War.
Most of us didn't realize that there were other routes planned, so I kind of found that pretty fascinating.
Right.
Well, let's talk for a minute about Evanston, since we have so many folks here, and I do have some questions about that. So how did Evanston become a division point for the Union Pacific, and why do we have this magnificent structure here?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Absolutely.
About the only one I'll know. When I was doing my research, the tracks were laid in Evanston Christmas, the week of Christmas. They came through our community, so I can't imagine what it would be like to lay in those tracks in December of 1868. They didn't stay here, of course. They went to Wasatch. They reached Wasatch on New Year's Day, which most of us in here, I think, know where Wasatch is. It's just down the road east. So they get there on New Year's Day, and that's where their terminal, if you will, was going to be located. And they stayed there until 1871. In 1871, they found out quickly that Wasatch would not serve their needs. They didn't have adequate water, and they needed access to the coal. And of course, the coal was an enemy. So in 1871, they moved back to Evanston and established the terminal here. And I don't know exactly what year it was, but if you look in the back of the room, there's a picture that's just been hung this week. And that picture is the first roundhouse that was built in Evanston. A lot of people do not know that the roundhouse that we're in today is the second roundhouse for this community. The building in the back of that photo is a stone, wonderful stone building with beautiful arched doorways, and it's a good thing it's gone because we'd be trying to save it. It had a manual turntable, and you can see in the picture where there was a large wooden lever where they actually all the men came out at one given time to turn a locomotive. It must have been something spectacular to see. There's a peg-legged man in the photo, and I often, when I look at that photo, which I look at it quite often, I often think maybe he was a casualty of that turntable. He either got run over by, got his leg run over or something like that, to that extent. Evanston really grew a lot because of moving back here. And of course, Wyoming's a territory then, but what I've read is the fact that this became a major terminal for the shipment of sheep and cattle. And so cattle from as far as Montana, Idaho, sheep, this all came to Evanston and was sent out at this location. So you see the first roundhouse was built, I'm guessing that was built in the 1880s, and was discontinued in 1912 when this building was built. I'm not sure when they tore it down. That site, where that roundhouse stood, is where the present day City Hall is located. So to give you some kind of context to where it was in our community. That's basically, again, I often think about how miserable the conditions would have been to come through Evanston the last week in December, next to last week in December, laying the track. It's just hard to imagine how that was accomplished.
It must have been extremely cold and snowy. I can't imagine the difficult conditions.
And I want to add that one of the main reasons for Evanston's growth is that the Union Pacific designated this place as a division point, and that was very important. Cheyenne was a division point, Laramie, Rawlins. The division point meant that the railroad was going to invest money in infrastructure. They were going to build roundhouses, they were going to build turntables, they were going to be a permanent fixture in the community, unlike some of these other towns along the way that just kind of dried up and disappeared after the railroad moved on. Places like Benton and Bryan, they're just no longer around. So that Evanston became a railroad town because the Union Pacific wanted a division point here.
I have a show and tell. I guess what we can do is just wrap this around everyone, but this photo depicts the roundhouse I talked about on the right, and in it, it shows the Marks Hotel, and it shows the, I think what was called the Pacific Hotel, and the Pacific Hotel, when I was a kid, my father called it the Beanery. They obviously ate there and stayed there. I don't know if my dad did, but the Beanery was located right just north of where the depot exists today in our community. And Shelley will remember this because he's a lot older than I am. Shelley Horn's in the audience, but I can kind of remember when this place caught on fire. I think it was in the 50s when it caught on fire and basically burned to the ground. But by looking at this photo, you really get a sense of what Tom's talking about and how Evanston grew because of the Union Pacific.
Kill yourself.
Well, that was kind of my next question. Talk about the growth of Evanston after becoming in the Union Pacific. But while we're talking about it, last night one of the things that was mentioned was how many existing roundhouses are there still in Wyoming? Is this the only one?
It's the only one. There's a section in Cheyenne, of course. And Uinta County had two that I know of. Piedmont had a roundhouse. And actually, it wasn't long ago I was out there and you could tell where the roundhouse was.
Now, as far as the turntable went, did you say that was manually operated?
The one that was
Yeah.
occupied the first roundhouse did, yes.
Can you imagine men turning a huge locomotive around by hand? You know, when the Union Pacific came out of Cheyenne, they had to go up Sherman Hill, and that was the highest point of the Union Pacific. That's the highest point of the entire railroad from Omaha to California. And when they reached Sherman, a little town developed around it, and they also built a turntable. And I was out there, and you'll see this if you tune in on the 10th of March, you'll see this. I was out there with Dr. Larry Ostrich, who is a geologist from the University of Wyoming, and he pointed out where this old turntable, you can still see the foundations of the old turntable. I said, how in the world could they have done this by hand? He said, when the locomotive was pulled onto it, it was so perfectly balanced on this thing that it really took only a few people, a few power to turn it. I was just amazed. But they could just balance it so perfectly. It was kind of like a fulcrum effect, and they had these, large handles coming up the sides, and they just turned the sucker around.
Amazing engineering feats. Well, here's a question, and we'll open it up to audience questions too here in a second, but can you tell us more about the bear ponds and how Evanston supplied reefer cars and what that meant? I mean, we all heard about reefers today, but I suspect it's not the same.
Well, the ponds were used to provide blocks of ice for the Pacific Fruit Express that came through here, bringing produce from the West Coast east. And they had cleaners, and they had cutter saws, and they cut the blocks in like 22-inch squares, and then they would float them down to put into these. Have you ever seen a picture of the ice houses? They were long buildings. They were probably right located about where Dave's Meats is in that area. They were right there by the ponds, and they were packed in sawdust from the sawmill, from Atkinson's sawmill, and that kept them frozen until they were gone. But they were loaded by men into either end of these reefer cars that were full of vegetables or whatever they want to keep cold, with ice tongs. They were taken on an elevator. Conveyor belts, sorry, right, more. And then they were put into these reefers on either end and kept the produce fresh.
And Kate provided some archival photos. You'll see this when you tune in to see the show. We have photographs of the ice houses and the guys out there in the bear pond sawing away at the ice and packing sawdust and stuff. It's pretty neat.
They made $2.50 a day, and if they brought a team of horses, they made $2.50 more.
And of course, because Evanston had a river and it was plenty cold, they had lots of ice in the winter. Okay. So talk a little bit about the Chinese population in Evanston. We talked about this last night in Rock Springs, but I suspect there are different stories from Evanston.
Well, obviously most of us here, because of a lot of things that happened in Evanston the last several years with the building of the replica of the Jaws House, we've really come a long ways in learning about our Chinese heritage, our Chinese history. Denise just wrote a book about the Chinese in our community. What I thought was fascinating is, and I'm not sure if this is factual, but the Chinese came here to lay track, and then they stayed because they were very good at working in the mines. That's why they stayed here. And I was told, and I don't know if this is true, that they actually walked from Chinatown to work every day. I don't know if that's factual or not, but it's hard to imagine not only going to work and putting in a shift in the mine and then walking back home. And that's about a, 5-mile hike or 4-mile hike. So I don't know if anybody in the audience knows if that's factual or have heard stories about that, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Tom, do you want to?
And of course, after the, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of the Chinese massacre in Rock Springs. And when that had happened, they fled, and I guess they boarded the train and fled over here to Evanston. And then finally, eventually, they went back. But, you know, the Chinese were recruited at Rock Springs. It was just the men that came over from China. They did not bring their families with them. They were just here to work and make money and then go back home. And eventually they did. The Union Pacific, they retired, and the Union Pacific gave them a pension. And there's a great photograph of these Union Pacific executives saying goodbye to the Chinese on a ship in New York Harbor. And they still collected their pensions in China for many years.
You know, can we, let me get my mic down there, so if we have some mic, oh, there's Lee, okay? Let's, thank you.
Why the New York harbor rather than San Francisco?
Well, maybe it was San Francisco.
San Francisco.
It was San Francisco, I'm sorry.
Are there other questions from folks? We have a microphone here. Yeah, Lee, there's a question up here.
Push the button.
Hello? We should have brought one of our station technicians, I think, with us tonight.
In the film clip, there was a lithograph that I'm familiar with of Evanston. It's a bird's eye view, and I'm wondering, Kay, if you know, you may know more about that than we do, but are there multiple copies of that, or is there an original, or is there, well, tell us more about
I've
that.
never seen the original. I know there are copies everywhere. But I've never seen the original. I don't know if there's one in the library or not. I think we just passed that picture around.
And I don't know where the original is either.
Probably in Omaha.
I know it's also, I know it also exists at the State Archives in Cheyenne, but it's not the original.
We don't know who took it. Do we not know who took it either? Who took
It's
it?
a drawing.
Oh, it's a drawing. Oh, okay. Anybody else, questions? Okay, well, let me continue then. Tell us about Piedmont and charcoal. Jim?
Sure. I think most of us in Ewing County are familiar with the charcoal kilns, as we refer to them in Piedmont. Look at my notes here. What they were doing is, obviously there was all kinds of impacts with the railroad in the Piedmont area, Hilliard and Margaret Lester. You want to come up here and talk about the flume at the Hilliard, and they made ties. They had tie hikers. They floated the ties down the river, and some of the scraps in those ties went into smelting and was used to make the charcoal. And the charcoal was used for the steel mills, or they weren't called steel mills then, but they were used for the mills in Orem, Utah, and once the use of coke was not discovered, but how coke was used rather than the smelting material, that was the demise of the charcoal at the time. But that's what the charcoal kilns were all about, and there's been a lot of work to rehab those structures, and there's been a lot of great interpretation. I encourage people to go out and visit that site. All that's happened in the last year, so.
So they also use the charcoal to heat the train cars.
Right.
So is Piedmont, can you find it? Is it?
Yes, it's very accessible.
And Jim took us out there last year on our shoot, and we did spent about a half a day out in Piedmont. And then we also have some, Ruby was talking about this over Wyoming, with all this helicopter footage. We have some helicopter footage of Piedmont in here too. That's quite spectacular. But, you know, Piedmont also, there was a very famous incident that happened in Piedmont as regards the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that was, you all saw Dr. Thomas Durant up here in this clip, and he really was kind of a scandalous fellow. He really wanted to line his own pockets and really built a lot of government money on false pretenses. And that was the guy that you remember was making those big loops and curves and trying to lay the most track so he'd get the most money. So as the Golden Spike was about to happen in Promontory Summit, Utah, in 1869, in May, he was coming out for the ceremonies because he was, you know, a big promoter. He just loved to be in the spotlight. And they got to Piedmont, and they were traveling in this really opulent, what they called a palace car. And I mean, it was, you know, mahogany and brass, and it was, you know, fine wines and things like that. And they were steaming their way out to the big celebration at Promontory Summit. And they hit Piedmont, and there's a blockade by the workers, by the track layers. They hadn't been paid for a long time. Typical Durant. So they blockade the train, they take it to the side tracks and say, you're not going any further until we get our money. And history doesn't record if Durant was scared or furious. I would suspect the latter. he wires back to a station, down the tracks via telegraph, and to Oliver Ames, who was the president of the Union Pacific at that time. He wires $50,000, and that seems to appease the workers temporarily, so they let him pass. But what happens is that the Golden Spike ceremony in Promontory was delayed by a couple of days because of this event in Piedmont. And Thomas Durant kind of got his comeuppance a little bit.
There was at least 300 men at that holdup in Piedmont at the time. Can you imagine 300 men working out there? It's kind of hard to imagine today. It's a scheme. But Piedmont's demise came about because of the Aspen Tunnel, and the stuff I was reading and researching a little bit was in 1868, 1869, of course, they're laying the track, and to travel, I guess, from east to west, it took around 71 hours. And by 1898, through the work of Perryman, they eliminated a lot of the curves and the Aspen Tunnel, and it cut it from the time down from 71 hours to 39 hours in 30 years. So I thought that was quite interesting.
But you gotta just think about, though, after it was completed.
Right.
I mean, wagon travel took months. This was transformational. People could get across the country in hours now. It was unbelievable. It was an unbelievable engineering achievement. Some people like to call it the greatest engineering achievement of the 19th century, and I tend to agree with it. And that's kind of made even more impressive by the fact you got to remember, this was basically all done by hand. This is all manual labor. Of course, they had some horses and some scrapers, but basically, it was hard manual labor. And they pulled it off in 7 years from the very first signing. And they really didn't start it until 1865 on the Omaha end. So that's just 4 years from going from Omaha to Promontory Summit. So it was a remarkable, remarkable achievement.
If they laid 1 to 2 miles a day, that was considered a good day's work.
Yeah.
And every once in a while they'd have a contest, and I think the Central Pacific laid 15 miles in 1 day or something like that. In our neck of the woods, from Bryan, I think it was Bryan to Granger, they set a record and laid 7 miles in 1 day for track.
That's astonishing.
Yeah, it is astonishing. We really haven't talked about how the railroad contributed to Wyoming as a state, because when, it was still a territory when it came to Cheyenne. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when the railroad reached Cheyenne, they created a division point, and there was no Wyoming at that time. It was part of Dakota Territory, and it was kind of this far-flung western suburb, if you will, of Dakota Territory. Dakota Territory really didn't want much to do with it. It was too far away, they couldn't govern it. So the people of Cheyenne started really lobbying for territorial status. And by the time the railroad had reached mid-state at the time, they got it. They got territorial status for Wyoming. Then, of course, statehood followed years later. But so, when I say there was no Wyoming at the beginning of the program, there was no Wyoming, and the Union Pacific is why, in its present configuration, it exists today.
If you think about Evanston, because of the Union Pacific, we were home to the state hospital before we were a state. So during the territory, when Evanston existed, the state hospital was formed even before Wyoming statehood. So that is a huge impact of how what the railroad had on this community.
But our courthouse was the first courthouse in the Wyoming Territory.
Is that right?
The Evanston courthouse was the first courthouse? So you hung a few criminals out here, huh?
Yeah, Butch
That's
Cassidy-
another story.
Butch Cassidy was supposedly in the Uinta County Jail. Spent time in our jail here. What's also interesting is when, by 1890, when we became a state, the Uinta County extended all the way from its border in the south, all the way up to Yellowstone Park. And I would imagine it kind of follows suit from west to east, if you will, because the state was established in the southern tier. That's where the railroad came, and that's where the communities. We're a lot older than most of the communities north in northern Wyoming.
Do we have any memories or stories out here that people would like to tell about some of the history? Oh, we've got one
I
right
have a
there.
question.
Okay, here.
Jim, you know anything about the flume from Mill Creek to Piedmont? And does any of that exist today, you know?
I don't know. I would ask, you know? Speak up.
There are places along the route that you can still see remnants of the, and I,
Can we get, Lee, can we give her a mic so we can hear over here? Thank you.
Probably what I may have to tell you might not be exactly correct. It's been too long since I wrote the book and I can't remember. But it seems like the flume was like 20, 25 miles long. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's easily.
And it went from Mill Creek down, it came to Hilliard Station and there, and I have to boast about it now because I have the money, but there are like 29 kilns at Hilliard Station.
Yeah.
And they originally they floated the logs in the, down the flume, but by the time they got to Hilliard, they were so banged up that later they moved the mill down to Hilliard Station. And they floated the logs whole, and then when they got there, they cut them and put them in the kilns to smell their bacon smell, but make the charcoal out of. And Hilliard Station was a big shipping area for cattle and sheep, and they bring the sheep there in the spring, and they ship in shearers, and they shear the sheep in the spring. It was at one, and I heard someone say this or read it somewhere that it was more populated at Hilliard Station at one time. It was a bigger city than Evanston at one time. But then when they did the Aspen Tunnel too, that did away with the need for, I mean, the railroad didn't come through there. And the demise of the charcoal, so Hilliard. My husband's grandfather bought the property where the kilns and all that was, and there were still like 5 or 6 kilns and a pile of logs there, and he run the kiln. He fired up the kiln one more time and made charcoal. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
You know, Jim was talking about the realignment, the downturn in Piedmont because of the Aspen Tunnel and stuff. After the Golden Spike was hammered in, they had thrown down tracks so fast and were in such a rush to complete it that when the passenger service started running again, they had to go back and basically redo everything. It was just a terrible, terrible condition. So it's kind of like, you know, kind of like painting the Brooklyn Bridge. Once you finish painting it, you start over again. And that's what they had to do with the railroad. It was in rough shape from the very beginning.
Any other questions, memories out there? Okay, here's one, Lee. Yeah, we'll get the microphone so we can hear it on camera.
We're talking about laying rail. It's not straight across Wyoming or anywhere else. How did they bend the rail?
Well,
Jumped up and down it 5,000 times. I have no idea.
Does anybody have an answer?
I really don't know. I know that the that the rails themselves at the time were kind of the steel layer that could come apart. So I would imagine that it was done in a manufacturing plant somewhere, that they did radius curves to a certain specification and laid it that way. If you go up to Promontory, I'm sure a bunch of folks have been out to see the Golden Spike Monument out there. They have a section of original rail out there. You can really see it starts to separate and flake off because of the process that they use. It's kind of compressed steam.
Thank you, Julie. Any other questions or comments out there? Oh, we have one over here, Lee.
I have a big voice, so I could probably just holler.
Oh, well, we're trying to record it for the camera.
Oh,
Yeah.
I had a question, I don't know if Jim can answer this or who, but I was wondering about Carter. Wyoming was another one of those areas that was kind of a major shipping point just west of here, and it was kind of in its heyday, a pretty good sized little community. I always wondered what the demise of Carter was, why it quit thriving, and maybe how big it got at one time.
Well, of course, there was a depot in Carter, and so it had to be quite active. I would say simply just because of the efficiencies of the engines, the section camps started to dry up, and one by one, all the stops, like for example, between Evanston and Granger, just went by the wayside. There was no longer a need to stop there. I think everyone knows that the reason we're here, as I explained earlier about the Wasatch situation, but in Wyoming, all the major communities are 100 miles apart. Well, that's because every 100 miles, the engines had to be serviced. It's 100 miles from here to Green River or Rock Springs to Rawlins is 100 miles, and Rawlins to Laramie is 100 miles. The only exception is, because of Sherman Hill, the distance between Cheyenne and Laramie. So by design, by reason, we're all settled 100 miles apart due to the railroad. And likewise, all the section camps, Leroy, Carter, all those places in Uinta County, one by one, as years went by, more efficiency caused the demise of those section camps.
Very interesting. I did not know that. Thank you, Jim. Well, one thing we haven't talked about is how the railroads, why did they need coal, and how many places in Wyoming were able to provide that? I know Rock Springs did, but
Well, there's actually coal mines all the way across the state. If you look, there's coal in the earth, and I think that's why they came across Wyoming to begin with, because they availability of coal, and they needed the coal to fire the steam engines.
Also, you know, the Oregon Trail wagon train route was about 100 miles north of the Union Pacific route. And you're right, part of the reason that they chose this more southerly route was because of the coal seams. They were first burning wood, and then they started burning coal. And when I'm sure you've seen pictures of these steam engines puffing along, they were really spewing out a lot of filthy smoke and grit. And when they pulled into a town, the prevailing winds would take all this smoke and ash and dump it in a specific part of town. And that part of town became known as the wrong side of the tracks.
But Alamy played a major role here because the coal that was in Alamy in the early history of the Union Pacific. And actually, Alamy probably at one time was probably the same size as Evanston in the early history.
There were 22 coal mines in Alamy.
really rich history. We haven't talked much about Green River, and as I understand it, Green River really doesn't owe its beginning to the Union Pacific. Is that right?
Well, I don't know about that. Green River is a major terminal on the Union Pacific line, so I don't know.
When they first established, for trade and those early businesses, industries, and
Well, what happened happened with Union Pacific. The federal government was giving out land grants, and Union Pacific was in turn becoming a real estate agent. I mean, when they came through into Laramie, 400 lots were sold within a couple of days. So they were not only making money from the government by, per mile per tract, but they were also becoming land barons and real estate developers. When they got to Green River, there was already people that had built this adobe town, and they had done a land grant. They had homesteaded the place basically, and the Union Pacific did not have land ownership in Green River. The reason these folks did it was they thought they were going to make a pile of money because they knew the railroad was going to have to stop because of the water. But the Union Pacific was not at all pleased about this, and so they just steamed right past Green River. And about 15 miles past Green River, they established this town of Bryan, which is on the Blacks Fork of the Green River. And Bryan was a booming community for about 3 or 4 years. And Green River was just nothing. Then Mother Nature took over. A terrible drought, multi-year drought. The Blacks Fork essentially dried up, and the Union Pacific was forced to eat crow and go back and make Green River a railroad town.
Something we didn't know about Green River. Thanks, Tom. Any other memories, questions?
What saved Evanston when the railroad pulled out permanently in '71? Because it was a railroad town up to until that time.
1971?
Yeah.
1971.
Yeah. What transition in Evanston to save it?
You came here. In 1971?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, 1971 is when the shops closed.
Yeah.
And I think, as I recall, because I was old enough to remember then, it was pretty bad straits in Evanston in 1971. You graduated from high school and you had to almost leave to get a job anywhere. And as luck would have it, it's in the late 70s, it's in the mid 70s, the natural gas exploration and boom is what saved Evanston. Right. Yes.
Well, again, 71 too, we really thought.
We're bringing you Mike.
We really did think that when they closed the shops and a lot of the people that left Evanston and moved to the Ogden area, that we really did fear our town would dry up and go away, but we did still have the state hospital that employed a good number of people here. And then, like Jim said, later in the late 70s, I don't know whether we were real thrilled about it or not, but we suddenly had this huge boom, and other people in here can share my thoughts, but we really were afraid our town, don't you agree, Kay, that our town would dry up when the engineers and other folks who worked for the railroad moved, but we held on, and like I said, I think probably the state hospital was a huge reason because of that. And then here came that damn boom.
If you think about it though, this building we're in, it's almost like a cat with 9 lives. It was built in 1912. In 1926 they shut it down. It was closed in 1926 after a very short period of time, and it was one of the first to close in our state, the first roundhouse facility to go by the wayside. What happened is the trains were more efficient, they could make it run from Green River to Ogden. There was no need to stop in Evanston any longer. So there was such an outcry by the citizens at the time in 1926, they actually got on the train, rode back to Omaha, the leaders of our community, begged them to reopen this complex, the roundhouse complex. And they did, and they reopened in 1927. And so that was its rebirth, if you will, and lasted till 1971, and when they closed it. And then we started working, the city began working in earnest on rehabbing, restoring, rehabilitating, preserving this site in 1998, when we started to work down here. So it's almost had two lives of its own, where we're at today. And I thought it was interesting, which would explain why Evanston had such major employment at this site. If you go out and see the wall, the picture on the wall that's out in the corridor, over 300 men working down here during World War II. In 1869, when the UP was originally built, it consisted of 1,070 miles. By 1950, that had grown to 9,721 miles. And the reason for that is obviously they expanded, but the Oregon Short Line, they went to different parts of the United States. But in that period of time, they expanded to 9,721 miles by 1950. Well, in 1950, this place was a roaring. This was a great complex, and it was just after the war, and this was a major employer in Evanston for many years.
Jim Davis started this. I want to deny that I laid track here in 1869. Actually, I've had an experience with the Union Pacific Railroad that lasted a good number of years. I probably am one of a few of the remaining telegraphers on the Union Pacific Railroad. I started 60 years ago in Rawlins, Wyoming, as a telegrapher, and I worked in the next 10 years in every depot from Rawlins to Wasatch. And I've seen a lot of things happen along the railroad during that time. In Wasatch, at that time in '53, they were running steam engines from Ogden to assist the freight trains up the hill, and they turned them at Wasatch. There was a Y out at Wasatch where they were able to turn the steam engines and send them back to Ogden by themselves. In Altamont, in the wintertime, it was very, very difficult to get into Altamont. I remember spending sometimes more than an hour trying to get into Altamont to work from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning, and there were days, at least one day I can recall, that I couldn't get out of Altamont, so I had to stay out there. When I worked at Bitter Creek, I didn't have a car at that time, and the only way that I could get to Bitter Creek or to Wamsutter from Rollins was to have the train dispatcher put me on a caboose and then have the train stop at the depot and drop me off. And that leads me to a memory of probably the most exciting time that I ever had on the railroad, was when a dispatcher stopped at 4000 Engine in Wamsutter to pick me up and take me back to Rollins. And I actually was so thrilled to ride the biggest steam engine in the world over the Continental Divide. Something I will never, ever forget. Wonderful experience. But I don't know that there are a whole lot of us left, but there are a few. And we didn't start out laying track.
And I thank you for that story. And I did want to point out that as the Union Pacific was being built in 1868 across Wyoming, so was they were stringing telegraph lines at the same time.
I was just going to ask, what does a telegrapher do on the railroad? Because I don't know.
Grainger's main responsibility was to report the movement of trains to the dispatcher. Between Ogden and Green River, there was a dispatcher in Green River. And then between Green River and Cheyenne, there was a dispatcher in Cheyenne. And when you worked in Rawlins, you worked with both the Green River dispatcher and the Cheyenne dispatcher. It was very important at those times to know where the trains were, and the only way they could tell where they were is to have a telegrapher report the movement. The other responsibility we had was to examine the train as it went by and report hot boxes. They don't have hot boxes on trains anymore, but back in those days, the bearings would get hot and set fire to the journal, I guess, on the wheels. And there were times when you actually needed to stop a train. I also had some experiences in Granger. You mentioned the Oregon Short Line. The Oregon Short Line took off from Granger and went up to Kemmer. And that was the only place that I was aware of that there was an interlocking station on the railroad where you actually controlled the direction of the train. It would come out of Green River, and if it was headed for the Oregon Short Line, then the telegrapher in Granger would control the switches and the signals to allow the train to go up that direction instead of down the main line. That was basically it.
Pretty important job. Thank you for that story. Are there other comments or stories that we can make sure we include them all? So we just don't have my dumb questions here. Okay. Anything else that we've missed here? I know we heard a couple of interesting stories last night about the condition of the men who worked there and what their eating conditions were like, and that was a great story that we heard from David Kafka last night.
Yeah, in the track laying camps, they had long boxcars for sleeping quarters and also dining rooms. And the dining rooms in these cars were comprised of long wooden tables and long benches with tin plates that were nailed to the tables. And the reason that they were nailed to the tables was because after one crew finished eating, a guy would come along with a mop and a bucket and swab out plates to prepare them for the next diners coming in, in which they would slop the food back onto the plates, and this process continued.
Gourmet delight. Well, have we missed anything? I have many more questions here, but if people would like to get a cup of coffee, have a cupcake, we also could take a break, or what's your pleasure? Panelists? Lots more to cover? Have we missed something?